Hi there and welcome to this week's tutorial. So it's been requested that we explain the differences between two back-bending poses, upward facing dog and Bhujangasana. So when we've noticed in classes that there is a little bit of confusion between the two, there is a lot of similarities, but there's also some differences. So we're going to take you through both poses today and a few different variations in the lead up to full poses and show you the differences between the two. So I've got the lovely Ange here today. She's going to come down to lying on her tummy. And we're going to start with Bhujangasana, or also known as serpent pose. So we lay on our tummy and we still create the length in the legs. So we grip and lift the knees to firm the thighs. We stay on the fronts of the feet here, okay? In this pose, in Bhujangasana, the full pose, we actually have the feet together. The tailbone is in and the pubic bone lifting up towards the navel. So the legs are set and they're long. So with the legs nice and set and long, a similarity for both this and upward facing dog is the length of the spine continues. We don't jam into the back at all. So depending on what phase you're at with stiffness in the dorsal spine, you may need to adjust the arm distance or the bend of the elbows depending on what you're working with. But today, to give the demonstration, Angie's going to actually just bring her hands out towards the front edge of her mat to start with. Yeah, elbows tuck into the sides and she can just rest on the forearms here for a moment. So with a Bhujangasana or serpent pose, as I said, we keep stretching the legs out the back. We want to move the dorsal spine in here towards the chest wall to get a length of the spine, so the tailbone's still long, a length of the spine, and lifting of the chest. From here, as you keep that action, the lengthening from the head to the toes, you can begin to press into the palms here to start to straighten the arms to lift the chest. Now in this pose, the hips stay on the ground, the legs stay on the ground, as do the feet. The hands as well, the dorsal spine keeps moving in, chest moves through and up, and at the end stage of the pose, the head actually goes up. So like the serpent is striking. So this is a variation of the pose here. Angie's just going to bend her elbows slightly. For some of you, if you start to find an increase in pressure or tension in the lower back, I would suggest that you work with bent arms and really focus on the length of the spine rather than trying to get the arms straight. So Angie's going to lower back down here and just take a rest for a moment. Turning the head to the side or head down, that's fine. Good. So in the full pose of this, the hands actually come back next to the chest, and full pose is arms are completely straight. But for many people in the learning stages of this pose, with the hips down, it can really jam into the lower back. So to take the hands a little further forward is suggested, and or keeping the elbows bent until you learn to keep the spine long and the legs long. So Angie's going to attempt full pose now. So the legs come together. She sets the legs in Tadasana. The tailbone comes long. The pubic bone lifts, dorsal spine in. She presses into the palms to lift the chest now. The hips and the legs stay on the ground. She stretches the toes back. Dorsal spine in. We're finding length in the spine. And then lowering back down towards the mat. Good, take rest, Ange. So that's Bhujangasana. The similarities of this pose with upward facing dog is that the legs need to remain constant and in work to keep the length of the spine, the dorsal spine moving in for the chest to open. So to come into an upward facing dog pose today, I'm going to get Ange to push back to child's pose now. So she's going to come back to Mukha Virasana. Good. And then she's going to come into downward facing dog pose. So coming forward over the wrist, turning the toes under and straightening the legs. Good. So downward facing dog or Adho Mukha Svanasana. Now from here, I'm going to get Ange to stay on the balls of the feet for the first round. She's going to come forward and drop the hips forward towards the wrists, keeping the legs really firm. So let the hips come through, Ange, for upward facing dog. But, yeah, stay on the feet.
Okay.
Good. Grip the knees here. She needs to press the heels back to keep the firmness of the legs. The tailbone is long. We don't dip into the back here. The dorsal spine needs to come in. The chest lifts. Good. Let's go back to dog pose and hold here. So the differences in this pose is, as you can see this in upward facing dog, Angie's legs and hips are off the mat. So she's going to do that one more time, staying on the balls of the feet. So she keeps the legs firm in Tadasana to keep the length of the spine. The hips drop through and draw forward towards the wrist as she stretches the hip flesh back towards the heels. Dorsal spine is in, chest is up, and she goes back to dog pose. So that's a beautiful variation being on the balls of the feet. The full pose is in fact on the fronts of the feet, similar to Bhujangasana. And it's a little more challenging because the thighs get closer to the floor, and sometimes for many, there's a tendency for the knees to drop to the floor. So this round, Angie's going to come onto the tops of her feet. So she comes through, she rolls onto the tops of her feet, but she has to keep the legs long. The legs have to work. So there's this clearance here between the front of the thighs and the hips. The tailbone is long, the dorsal spine is in, the chest is up. There is length through the pose. No jamming. And back to dog pose, she rolls back. And let's take her to child's pose for a little rest. She's working hard. Good. So there's many similarities in these two poses, but some vast differences as well, particularly in the legs and the hips. So for many at home, as we practice this pose, you will begin to get, a little bit of discomfort perhaps in the lower back if the legs are starting to fade or if the arms are starting to fade as well. There are many variations to practice this pose. For example, we could place a long three-fold blanket or the like across the front of the mat. So Angie's going to go to dog pose again, Adho Mukha Svanasana. And I'm going to slide in here a long threefold to give her something to work from. So she's going to come forward again into an upward facing dog on the fronts of her feet. And she draws the hips through towards the wrist. Now the legs here, if they touch on that blanket and brush, she needs to activate the legs again. The dorsal spine moves in, chest up, so we don't want to relax onto the blanket. We're using the blanket as a feedback system to bring intelligence into the legs, to get length in the spine. Back to dog pose, Adho Mukha Svanasana. So that is one option. There are many more variations, and come down to child's pose. In encouraging or making sure that the legs work well to keep the length into the spine to get the action of these two poses. So hopefully that has made things a little clearer for you, the differences between Bhujangasana, serpent pose, or upward facing dog. Thank you for joining in today.